ripple echo.
And we all have this feeling that I came into this world. Now, it isn't true. You came out of this world.
Series 1, Episode 4. The lens widens, from carbon borders to chip bans, rare earth quotas to retaliatory tariffs. Economic tools have become frontline weapons in a new kind of conflict. The era of trade as commerce is over. What remains is trade as leverage, policy as pressure, and markets as geopolitical terrain.
Today we're plunging into the world of international trade, but looking at it through, well, a bit of a different lens. We're going beyond the usual discussions of supply chains and market access to explore how tariffs, traditionally seen as economic shields, maybe to protect domestic industries.
Right, the classic view.
Exactly, how they've been repurposed, becoming more like, blunt diplomatic weapons, hurled unilaterally across borders, sometimes at friends, sometimes at rivals.
It's a fascinating and really significant shift, you're right. One that has fundamentally altered global trade dynamics and diplomacy itself.
Absolutely. So what are we going to cover in this deep dive? We'll need to look back at that significant departure in U.S. trade policy, the one that took shape between, say, 2017 and 2021 under the U.S. administration.
Yeah, that first Trump term.
We'll detail the specific types of tariffs imposed on major trading partners, particularly the European Union and China, and the domestic legal justifications the U.S. used, like Section 232 for national security and Section 301 for alleged unfair trade practices.
And we'll definitely explore the multifaceted responses from both the EU and China, because this wasn't just simple retaliation, was it? It involved direct counter tariffs, sure, but also complex legal challenges through the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and maybe most interestingly, these broader strategic shifts in their own trade and economic policies.
Right, things like the EU's pursuit of strategic autonomy.
Exactly, and China's adoption of dual circulation, big policy shifts.
Right. We'll also analyze some key negotiation outcomes from that first era, including the USMCA deal that replaced NAFTA and that Phase 1 trade deal with China, assessing what, if any, concrete concessions were actually obtained.
And then we need to pivot. Look at how these same tactics seem to be reappearing now in 2025, even being extended to non-trade issues like immigration, and see what the early results look like.
Crucially, we will assess the overall effectiveness of these tariff threats as a negotiating tactic. Did the U.S. actually achieve its goals? We'll try to weigh the immediate concessions against, the economic costs, the strained international relationships, and the longer-term impacts on the global trading system itself.
The big calculation.
What's truly fascinating here, and why this matters to you listening, is how tariffs became this primary instrument of pressure, almost the megaphone of modern diplomacy for a time. And this experience, this whole episode, has fundamentally altered how other foreign powers, after being on the receiving end, might now treat U.S. tariff threats. They've seen this playbook, haven't they?
They absolutely have. And they're starting to assess if the costs of, conceding under pressure are really worth the potential gains. Maybe even treating the threats more like a high-stakes poker bluff.
Yeah, calling the bluff.
Exactly. They've learned to evaluate the threat differently, and importantly, they've learned to build their own defenses, their own resilience. So let's unpack how this era of blunt force diplomacy using tariffs really got started.
Okay, let's unpack this. The period between 2017 and 2021 under the Trump administration truly marked a notable pivot in United States trade policy. If you followed trade at all during this time, you definitely saw a distinct shift towards a more protectionist stance.
Definitely more protectionist. And the unilateral imposition of tariffs on a really wide array of imported goods.
This wasn't just minor tinkering around the edges. This approach significantly impacted key trading partners, hitting both the European Union and the People's Republic of China particularly hard.
Big targets, big impacts.
And the U.S. administration didn't just impose tariffs out of the blue. They invoked specific domestic legal provisions as their basis. The two big ones you heard constantly were Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962.
Right, citing national security risks.
And Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the U.S. to respond to what it considers unfair trade practices by other countries.
It's probably helpful to look at the principal U.S. tariff measures that were implemented during this period, the ones that specifically targeted the EU and China and prompted their responses.
Okay, so for the EU, the main actions fell under that Section 232 banner. This included tariffs on steel and aluminum, effective June 1st, 2018, of a 25% tariff on imported steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum.
Pretty significant numbers.
Then, effective January 2020, they expanded this, adding Section 232 tariffs on certain steel and aluminum derivatives, applying 25% on steel derivatives and 10% on aluminum derivatives, things like nails, cables.
Right, downstream products. Now, for China, the measures were broader, much broader. They involved both Section 232 and the much more significant Section 301 actions.
So China also got hit with a 25% tariff on steel and 10% tariff on aluminum, starting March 23, 2018. But what was notable there, right from the start, was that China was explicitly not given the temporary exemption that some other trading partners initially received.
No initial carve-out for China on 232, but as you said, the real centerpiece of the U.S. action against China was the Section 301 tariffs. These came in multiple waves or tranches following a USTR, that's the U.S. Trade Representative investigation into China's practices regarding technology transfer, intellectual property, innovation, basically things the U.S. argued were unfair.
Right. So there was the first tranche imposing a 25% tariff on approximately $34 billion worth of Chinese imports, effective July 6, 2018. These initially targeted things like machinery, electronics, various industrial components.
Then came a second tranche, another 25% tariff, this time on about $16 billion worth of Chinese imports, effective August 23, 2018. This round expanded to products like semiconductors, chemicals, plastics, other industrial goods.
And then the third and largest tranche. Initially, this was a 10% tariff on a massive $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, effective September 24, 2018. This list was incredibly broad, covering a huge range of consumer goods, industrial goods.
Things people buy every day.
Exactly. But that rate didn't stick at 10%. It was later increased significantly to 25% in May and June of 2019 as tensions really escalated.
Big jump.
And finally, a fourth tranche, or List 4A, applied a 15% tariff on a subset of what was originally a $300 billion target list. This ultimately covered about $112 to $120 billion of imports and went into effect on September 1st, 2019.
Now, that one had a bit of a twist later. As a result of the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal signed in February 2020, that specific 15% rate was later halved to 7.5%.
Right. And tariffs on the remaining part of that big list, List 4B, they were planned but ultimately suspended, never went into effect.
One of the most contentious points, particularly from the perspective of U.S. allies, was the U.S. administration's invocation of national security under Section 232 to impose tariffs on close partners like the EU. This was seen as a really significant departure from how that provision had been used historically. Usually it was for, truly strategic materials in wartime, that sort of thing.
It definitely raised eyebrows, as you say.
Yeah.
And it was met with considerable skepticism by the affected countries, especially allies. They often viewed it less as a genuine security response and more as, a convenient legal justification, maybe even a pretext for protectionism.
Yeah, using national security as a cover.
And this really strained transatlantic relations. Frankly, it challenged the whole conventional understanding of the limits of what qualifies as a national security exception within the WTO framework, which predictably sparked legal challenges that directly questioned those boundaries.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the initial U.S. tariff offensive. The period between 2017 and 2021 saw a major shift in U.S. trade policy towards unilateral tariffs, primarily using domestic laws like Section 232, citing national security, and Section 301 for unfair practices. You got that?
Got it. These measures hit the EU and China hard, with China facing a much larger scale of tariffs under Section 301, those hundreds of billions.
Right. And a key point of contention, especially for allies, was the U.S. using national security to tariff partners like the EU, seen as controversial, really strained relationships.
And these actions really set the stage for the complex ways the EU and China pushed back.
So the European Union, when faced with these U.S. tariffs, they didn't just do one thing. They adopted a truly comprehensive strategy. It combined immediate, direct retaliatory measures.
From counter tariffs.
Exactly. But also legal challenges at the World Trade Organization, ongoing diplomatic engagement, and importantly, these broader strategic shifts in its trade policy for the longer term, thinking beyond the immediate fight.
Let's start with your direct counter tariffs. The EU's actions were primarily in response to those U.S. Section 232 duties on steel and aluminum. They viewed those U.S. tariffs as inconsistent with WTO rules and basically just safeguard measures, not genuine security actions.
So they didn't buy the justification.
Not at all. So they implemented what they called rebalancing measures. The first waves of these EU counter tariffs became effective on June 20, 2018, hitting a list of U.S. goods valued at approximately $2.8 billion.
And these specific measures were authorized under a, technical regulation, Commission Implementing Regulation, EU 2018-86. An annex to this regulation detailed the list of U.S. products subject to additional ad valorem duties, that's tariffs, based on the value of the goods set at either 10% or 25%.
And the selection of products wasn't random, was it? It seemed quite strategic. It appeared to target iconic American brands and goods produced in politically significant regions within the U.S.
Right, the political angle again?
Think examples like Harley-Davidson motorcycles, bourbon whiskey, Levi's jeans.
Iconic stuff.
And agricultural products like corn, rice, orange juice, cranberries, and tobacco, alongside some U.S. steel and aluminum products themselves.
This choice was clearly aimed not just at economic rebalancing, making the trade impact even, but also at exerting political pressure by impacting key constituencies in the U.S. It's a standard playbook in these kinds of disputes.
Hit them where it hurts politically.
Exactly. That regulation also outlined a potential second stage of tariffs in a separate annex, scheduled for June 1st, 2021, with rates ranging from 10% to 50% on a different list of goods. However, that second stage was ultimately suspended as U.S.-EU negotiations progressed. They held it back.
Then, following the U.S. decision to expand Section 232 to steel and aluminum derivatives in January 2020, the EU announced further retaliation on April 6, 2020.
Another round.
These were also implemented via specific regulation, Commission Implementing Regulation, EU 2020-502, effective May 8, 2020, imposing additional duties from 4.4% to 20% on a new list of U.S. goods.
Now, separate from that whole Section 232 response, the EU also imposed tariffs in the context of a completely different long-running WTO dispute concerning subsidies for large civil aircraft.
Ah, the Boeing case.
The famous Boeing-Airbus dispute, exactly, known in the WTO as DS-353. In this dispute, the WTO had actually authorized the EU to impose countermeasures against the U.S. because the U.S. hadn't complied with earlier WTO rulings regarding illegal subsidies to Boeing.
So this was WTO-sanctioned retaliation.
Precisely. Consequently, the EU levied additional tariffs on U.S. goods worth approximately $4 billion effective November 10, 2020. These were enacted through Commission Implementing Regulation EU 2020-1646.
And what did those cover?
Well, one annex of this regulation imposed a 15% additional duty specifically on certain U.S.-manufactured large civil aircraft, Boeing jets, basically.
Okay.
And another annex applied a 25% additional duty to a broad range of U.S. agricultural and industrial products. This list included things like various types of tobacco, tree nuts, chocolate products, tomato ketchup, spirits like rum, gin, and vodka, tractors, and even video game consoles. A real mix.
Interesting list. Now, these particular tariffs, the ones linked to the aircraft dispute, they were later suspended, right?
Right.
In March 2021.
That's right. Initially for 4 months, but that suspension was later extended as part of a bilateral US-EU agreement to kind of de-escalate that specific dispute and try to work towards a lasting solution for the whole aircraft subsidy mess.
So the EU was pretty clear about its reasons for these retaliatory measures across the board.
Oh yes, very clear. Regarding the U.S. Section 232 tariffs, the EU consistently argued they were inconsistent with WTO rules and were essentially just protectionist safeguards disguised as security measures. The EU's retaliation was framed as a permitted rebalancing under WTO law, implemented via the EU's own enforcement regulation.
And for the Boeing dispute tariffs.
The justification was straightforward. These were explicitly authorized by the WTO dispute settlement body due to the U.S. not complying with rulings on illegal Boeing subsidies. Throughout this period, EU officials kept emphasizing they preferred negotiated solutions but were absolutely determined to protect their interests, and, they would argue, uphold the rules-based international trading order if dialogue failed.
The EU's approach, hitting back with tariffs while also fighting it out legally at the WTO, it really highlights the significant strain these disputes put on the whole WTO system, doesn't it?
It really does. And the EU's legal basis for retaliating against the U.S. Section 232 tariffs, by characterizing them as safeguards, faced potential legal complexities within the WTO framework itself.
Oh, so.
Well, a later WTO panel ruling in China's case, challenging its retaliation to the same U.S. Section 232 measures, that's case DS-558, found that the U.S. measures were actually taken under the National Security Exception, GATT Article X1, not as safeguard measures, Article NX.
Ah, okay, so the panel accepted the U.S. justification in that context.
In that specific ruling on China's retaliation, yes. And because of that distinction, that DS-558 panel ruling actually deemed China's retaliation inconsistent with WTO rules governing safeguards.
Wow, okay. So even though that was China's case, did it affect the EU's position?
Well, it could have had indirect implications for how the EU's own similar retaliatory actions were viewed legally, even though, importantly, the EU's specific WTO case against the US Section 232 tariffs themselves, that's DS 548, eventually led to a panel finding the US tariffs inconsistent with WTO rules.
It sounds incredibly complicated. A real legal tangle.
It absolutely was. It shows the intricate tightrope countries were walking and just how much stress these disputes put on the WTO's rules and its ability to consistently interpret them.
Okay, so let's quickly summarize the EU's initial counter strategy again. The EU adopted a calibrated retaliation plan, carefully targeting specific US goods like bourbon, motorcycles, and jeans, using specific EU regulations to back it up. Got that?
Yep. Simultaneously, they relentlessly challenged the U.S. tariffs at the WTO, particularly the Section 232 measures in that landmark DS 548 case, which directly tested the U.S. justification based on national security.
Right. And while WTO panels did eventually find the U.S. actions inconsistent in some key cases, the U.S. effectively blocked final rulings by appealing into the void created by the crippled WTO appellate body, a key procedural block.
Exactly, a crucial point.
So beyond the immediate tariffs and the legal battles, the EU was also pursuing diplomatic negotiations and, maybe more importantly, starting to make these broader shifts in its overall trade policy strategy.
That's right. The EU consistently emphasized its preference for negotiated solutions with the U.S. to try and de-escalate tensions. There were numerous discussions, high-level talks throughout that 2017-2021 period.
For instance, in response to U.S. threats of even higher tariffs on EU goods,
Yeah.
especially automobiles, which was a huge concern.
A major threat.
Dialogues were actively pursued. A key proposal from the EU side was a zero-for-zero agreement, aiming to eliminate tariffs on all industrial goods, including cars. A big, ambitious idea.
But sources indicate the U.S. administration at the time was generally unwilling to go that far, reportedly unwilling to reduce its tariffs below a 10% baseline in those talks.
So, while a comprehensive deal stayed out of reach during that period, some limited progress was made.
Yes, a small mini deal was concluded in August 2020. The EU eliminated tariffs on U.S. lobster, kind of a specific win for a certain region.
Maine, presumably.
And the U.S. reduced rates by 50% on certain EU exports, like prepared meals and glassware. Small scale, but something.
But more significantly, and really as a direct outcome of the tensions from this era, in October 2021, the US and EU reached an understanding to resolve the Section 232 steel and aluminum dispute.
The TRQ deal.
Exactly. This agreement involved the US replacing the Section 232 tariffs on EU steel and aluminum with a system of tariff rate quotas, TRQs. This allowed a certain volume of EU exports to enter the US duty-free, with higher tariffs only applying above that quota.
And in return,
the EU agreed to suspend its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. Both sides also agreed to pause their DS 548 dispute proceedings at the WTO, kind of putting that fight on ice.
now facing the uncertainty and disruption caused by U.S. protectionism, the EU strategically accelerated its efforts to conclude trade agreements with other major global economies.
Hedging their bets.
Exactly. This was seen not only as an economic diversification strategy, reduce reliance on the U.S., but also as a political statement, affirming the international rules-based trading order that the U.S. seemed to be challenging.
A prime example of that was the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, right?
Absolutely. Negotiations concluded late 2017, signed July 2018, and it entered into force February 1st, 2019. EU officials explicitly framed this deal as a powerful signal against protectionism and a demonstration that major economies could still uphold and shape global trade rules through ambitious, comprehensive agreements.
And they pushed forward with others too, like Vietnam.
Yes, advancing deals with others was part of that broader diversification strategy.
The challenging experiences with U.S. unilateralism during this period also significantly contributed to an evolution in the EU's own strategic thinking, didn't it? Specifically around this concept of open strategic autonomy.
Yes, that phrase really gained prominence during these years. It's about strengthening the EU's capacity to act autonomously, to defend its own interests in an increasingly contested global environment, while still trying to remain committed to openness and international cooperation where possible. It's a balancing act.
And a concrete manifestation of this evolving strategy was the development of new trade defense instruments.
Exactly. While formally proposed a bit later, the concept for the Anti-Coercion Instrument, or ACI, really had its roots firmly in the heightened trade tensions from 2017-2021. It was seen as a direct response to U.S. tariff threats and actions, among other coercive economic practices globally.
What does the ACI actually do?
The ACI, which was ultimately adopted in November 2023, was designed to deter and counteract economic coercion by third countries through a range of potential EU countermeasures. These could include restrictions on trade, investment, intellectual property rights, basically giving the EU its own toolkit to push back against economic pressure separate from the WTO process.
So the U.S. America First policies, the unilateral tariffs, they created this unpredictable, often adversarial trade relationship with the EU. And this experience served as a powerful catalyst, arguably accelerating the EU's pursuit of that strategic autonomy.
I think that's fair to say, and the difficulties the EU faced in relying solely on established WTO mechanisms for dispute resolution, particularly given the U.S. actions that crippled the appellate body, really underscored for EU policymakers the necessity of developing more robust unilateral and plurilateral capabilities to defend themselves.
So the ACI's development is a clear sign of that strategic shift.
It really is. And simultaneously, the EU's active pursuit of FTAs with diverse partners like Japan and Vietnam was a deliberate strategy to diversify its economic relationships, reduce dependence on any single trading partner, and reinforce its own role and influence in global trade governance. It was effectively counterbalancing the U.S. unilateral pivot.
It really highlights how the U.S. actions, intended to pressure and gain concessions, actually kind of prompted the EU to become more independent and build its own defenses, maybe in ways the U.S. didn't anticipate.
Right, possibly.
So to sum up the EU's sophisticated, layered response, the EU combined calibrated retaliation on politically sensitive U.S. goods with relentless legal challenges at the WTO, directly testing the U.S.'s national security claims.
Right. This led to eventual diplomatic resolutions like the TRQ system for steel and aluminum, replacing the tariffs in October 2021, a key outcome.
I don't know. And perhaps most importantly, the U.S. approach accelerated the EU's strategic shift towards strategic autonomy, pushing it to deepen ties with other partners like Japan through new trade deals and develop its own defensive tools like the anti-coercion instrument, a fundamental shift.
Exactly. Here are some key takeaways from the EU's response, kind of flashcard facts for you. EU retaliated on 2.8B U.S. goods, Harley-Davidson bourbon, June 2018 for U.S. steel aluminum tariffs.
Got it.
EU challenged U.S. 232 tariffs at WTO, DS-540, arguing they violated rules and weren't genuine national security measures.
Check.
A WTO panel later agreed with EU on DS-548, but U.S. appealed into the void due to the non-functional appellate body.
Right, the void.
EU sought a zero-for-zero industrial tariff deal with the U.S., but talks stalled during the Trump term.
Didn't happen then.
U.S. and EU eventually replaced the steel aluminum tariffs with a tariff rate quota TRQ system in October 2021.
The TRQ deal.
EU accelerated FTAs like the Japan EPA and developed this strategic autonomy concept, partly in response to U.S. unilateralism.
Okay, strategic autonomy. Now let's turn to China. China's response to the U.S. tariffs was equally robust and multifaceted, wasn't it? It involved direct retaliation, extensive use of the WTO dispute settlement system, significant diplomatic engagement that eventually led to a trade deal, and perhaps most consequentially, these profound domestic policy adjustments aimed at long-term economic resilience and reduced external vulnerability.
Absolutely. Starting with their retaliatory tariffs, China implemented duties in direct response to both the U.S. Section 232 measures on steel and aluminum and that whole series of Section 301 tariffs, which were much larger in scale.
So China reacted promptly to the U.S. Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. Effective April 2, 2018, it imposed retaliatory tariffs on a list of 128 U.S. products, estimated to be worth approximately $3 billion in annual trade.
And the goods targeted were, again, strategic. Included a variety of agricultural products popular in the U.S. like fruits, apples, cherries, nuts, almonds, pistachios, pork, wine, and ginseng.
Things U.S. farmers export.
Exactly. As well as industrial items like seamless steel pipes and recycled aluminum, the retaliatory duties were set at rates of 15% or 25%.
Now, as the U.S. rolled out its Section 301 tariffs in those successive tranches, China mirrored these actions with its own countermeasures, often matching the scale and timing right.
Pretty much tit for tat initially. For the first tranche, coinciding with the U.S. implementation in July 2018, China implemented 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of U.S. goods. This list prominently featured major U.S. agricultural exports like soybeans, a huge one, corn, wheat, and cotton, as well as automobiles, aquatic products, and more pork.
Soybeans were a big political target.
Absolutely massive. In response to U.S. List 2 tariffs in August 2018, China imposed 25% tariffs on $16 billion worth of U.S. goods. Products targeted included U.S. chemical products, medical equipment, and energy products such as crude oil and coal.
Following U.S. tariffs on List 3 in September 2018, China retaliated with tariffs of 5% or 10% on $60 billion worth of U.S. goods. Then, when the U.S. escalated its List 3 tariffs from 10% to 25% in mid-2019.
China responded again. They increased their retaliatory tariff rates on that $60 billion list to levels ranging from 5% to 25%, effective June 1st, 2019, keeping pace.
And in response to U.S. List 4A tariffs in September 2019, China imposed tariffs, primarily at rates of 5% or 10%, on a subset of $75 billion worth of U.S. goods.
And these specific retaliatory tariffs were the ones later halved. For example, 10% rates reduced to 5% in February 2020 as part of the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade agreement. It's also worth noting China, like the U.S., set up product exclusion processes, allowing Chinese companies to apply for temporary exemptions from these tariffs if they could make a case.
What was China's official stance on all this? How did they justify their retaliation?
Their official stance, communicated by the Ministry of Commerce and other channels, was very consistent. They condemned the U.S. tariff actions as unilateral, protectionist, and clear violations of WTO rules. They framed their own retaliatory measures as necessary and legitimate responses to defend China's national interests, its industries, its consumers, and also to protect the integrity of the multilateral trading system.
So, similar framing to the EU in some ways.
In some ways, yes. Beijing argued it was being forced into retaliation by the U.S.'s aggressive policies, and that its actions were a reluctant but essential defense against what they explicitly called U.S. economic bullying or hegemony.
China's selection of products for retaliation, particularly targeting major U.S. agricultural exports like soybeans and pork, and manufactured goods like automobiles. That seemed highly strategic too.
Oh, absolutely. Like the EU, China aimed to inflict economic pain on politically sensitive sectors and regions within the U.S. to create domestic American pressure on the Trump administration. Soybeans, as you mentioned, are a massive U.S. export concentrated in key agricultural states, making them an incredibly potent target for political leverage.
Okay, let's quickly recap China's initial counter-strategy on the tariff front. China mirrored the U.S. tariffs, applying duties to billions of dollars worth of U.S. goods across multiple tranches, tit for tat.
Got it. They strategically targeted major U.S. exports like soybeans, pork, and automobiles, aiming to inflict economic and political pain on sensitive U.S. sectors.
Right. And China consistently justified its retaliation as a necessary defense against what it called U.S. unilateralism and violations of WTO rules, protecting its interests in the system.
Exactly. Now, alongside implementing tariffs, China actively engaged the WTO dispute settlement system to challenge the legality of U.S. tariffs imposed under both Section 232 and Section 301. They fought back on multiple fronts.
So, on April 5, 2018, very soon after the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs were announced, China requested WTO consultations, initiating dispute DS-544. What was their argument there?
China's primary argument was that the U.S. tariffs were inconsistent with fundamental WTO obligations, particularly the most favored nation principle, MFN, treating all countries equally, and rules on tariff bindings not charging more than you've agreed to. They argued the U.S. tariffs were discriminatory and exceeded agreed rates.
And what happened with that case?
A WTO panel was established, and its report, circulated in December 2022, found the U.S. tariffs inconsistent with its WTO obligations. And notably, it rejected the U.S. justification based on national security in this specific context.
But then the U.S. appealed.
As was common with adverse rulings against the U.S. during this period, yes, the U.S. appealed this panel report into the void due to the non-operational appellate body, preventing a final binding outcome.
Now, here's where it got a bit counterintuitive, as you mentioned before. Concurrently, the U.S. challenged China's retaliatory tariffs in a separate WTO dispute, DS-558. And the panel in that case found China's retaliation inconsistent.
That's right. In a panel report circulated in August 2023, the panel found China's retaliatory tariffs inconsistent with WTO rules.
What was the reasoning there? It seems contradictory.
The panel's reasoning in DS-558 was that the U.S. Section 232 measures were taken pursuant to the National Security Exception, JAT Article XE1, even though the other panel in DS-544 had questioned the U.S.'s use of that exception. Because the U.S. claims security under Article XE1 and not safeguard measures under Article 9X, The panel found that China was not entitled to retaliate against them in the way it did under the specific WTO rules governing retaliation for safeguard measures.
So the U.S. invoking national security kind of tied China's hands on how it could legally retaliate under WTO rules, according to that panel.
According to that specific panel ruling, yes. China subsequently appealed this ruling, but it really highlights the intricate and sometimes contradictory legal outcomes possible when the system is under stress and dealing with these novel arguments, like the widespread use of the security exception. Very messy.
China also initiated a series of WTO disputes specifically to challenge the various tranches of U.S. Section 301 tariffs,
Yep.
right? Those bigger ones.
Yes, DS 543 was the first and most significant case, challenging U.S. tariffs on the large List 1, 34D, and List 3, $200 pre-tranches, including the rate increase on List 3.
And the outcome there.
On September 15, 2020, the WTO panel issued its report in DS 543. It found that the U.S. Section 301 tariffs were indeed inconsistent with fundamental GT rules, violating the MFN principle by applying exclusively to China and exceeding U.S.-bound tariff rates. The panel also rejected the U.S. arguments attempting to justify the measures, a clear ruling against the U.S. tariffs themselves.
Why? But let me guess. The United States appealed this report too.
You guessed it. On October 26, 2020, the U.S. appealed, effectively halting further WTO proceedings due to the appellate body's paralysis. Same pattern.
China also requested consultations in DS 565 challenging List 2 and DS 587 challenging List 4A. Did those go anywhere?
Neither of those later cases advanced to a panel ruling within the 2017-2021 period. The core arguments were similar. The U.S. actions were discriminatory, violated basic trade principles, and were unilateral measures taken outside the proper WTO framework. But the focus was really on DS 543.
So China's active and systematic use of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, even while imposing its own retaliatory tariffs, that was a strategic move, wasn't it?
Absolutely. By aggressively pursuing these legal challenges, China aimed to secure international legal condemnation of the U.S. tariff actions, thereby portraying itself globally as a defender of the established multilateral trading system and international law, using the system to critique the system's challengers.
And this approach was designed to contrast sharply with the U.S.'s increasingly unilateral trade policy and its concurrent actions that were seen as undermining the WTO's own dispute resolution capabilities, particularly the crippling of the appellate body.
Exactly. China was essentially trying to win the legal and public relations battle by showing it was playing by the established rules, even as it fought back forcefully with tariffs, a dual-track strategy.
Okay, quick check-in on China's WTO fight. China extensively used the WTO system to challenge both the U.S. Section 232 tariffs, like in DS 544, and the much larger Section 301 tariffs, most notably DS 543.
Yep. WTO panels often found the U.S. actions inconsistent with global trade rules, but the U.S. effectively blocked final binding rulings by appealing into the void created by the non-functional appellate body.
Right. Adding a layer of complexity, a WTO panel in a separate case, DS 5558, found China's retaliation against the U.S. 232 tariffs inconsistent, citing the U.S.'s use of the national security exception as the legal hook for that particular finding.
A legal twist.
A key nuance. So beyond the tariffs and the intense legal challenges, China also engaged in diplomatic efforts, which eventually led to a trade deal, and maybe most importantly, began making these significant domestic policy adjustments that are likely to have profound long-term impacts.
That's right. The U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal signed in January 2020 was the most significant outcome of the diplomatic engagement during this period. It was the result of really complex negotiations, arguably forced by the economic pain the escalating tariffs were causing on both sides. It was framed at the time as a truce in the trade war.
What did China actually commit to in that Phase 1 deal?
Under this deal, China made a huge commitment to vastly increase its purchases of U.S. goods and services. The target was an extra $200 billion over 2020 and 2021, above the 2017 baseline levels. Massive numbers.
Specific targets.
Yes, specific targets were outlined for agricultural goods, energy products, and manufactured goods. China also made written promises on issues like improving intellectual property protection, refraining from forced technology transfer, opening its financial services sector more, and allowing greater foreign access in areas like agriculture and biotechnology, things the U.S. had been pushing for.
And what did the U.S. give in return?
In exchange, the U.S. agreed to hold off on imposing further tariff increases and to actually cut the rate on a portion of its tariffs, specifically on those List 4A goods, reducing them from 15% down to 7.5%. The U.S. also suspended indefinitely the tariffs that had been planned for the List 4B goods.
But importantly, the majority of the U.S. tariffs from the trade war remained in place.
That's crucial. The bulk of the tariffs, covering approximately $360 to $370 billion worth of Chinese imports, were not removed by the Phase 1 deal. They stirred.
So what was the outcome of this deal, especially those big purchase commitments?
Well, the outcome, particularly on the purchase commitments, was quite mixed, leaning towards disappointing from the U.S. perspective. But China ultimately fell significantly short of its ambitious purchase targets, purchasing only about 58% to 62% of the promised value by the end of December 2021.
Why did they fall short?
Factors cited included the global COVID-19 pandemic disruptions, which definitely impacted trade flows globally, but also likely China's ongoing efforts to diversify its import sources away from the U.S., a trend the trade war itself probably accelerated.
So the Phase 1 deal, while it provided a temporary pause, was maybe not the game changer it was initially billed as.
It was largely seen by experts as a managed trade agreement. Its primary focus was on hitting specific purchase targets rather than comprehensively addressing the underlying structural issues that were central to the original Section 301 investigation, things like China's extensive industrial subsidies, the role of state-owned enterprises, and policies supporting initiatives like Made in China 2025.
So it didn't fix the root causes.
Not really, and the limited success in meeting the purchase targets just underscored the inherent difficulties in using these kinds of bilateral agreements, driven primarily by tariff pressure, to fundamentally alter deep-seated economic models or achieve major structural changes.
Now, a truly pivotal policy shift in China during this period was the formal introduction and elevation of the dual circulation strategy. Tell us about that.
Yes, this is hugely important. First articulated by the CCP Politburo in May 2020, it quickly became a cornerstone of China's 14th five-year plan, covering 2021 to 2025. It's a fundamental strategic redirection.
What are the core goals? What does dual circulation mean?
The core goals are to fundamentally reorient China's economic development model. It prioritizes internal circulation, which means strengthening domestic production, domestic distribution, domestic consumption, basically relying more on their own huge internal market.
Okay, and the external part?
External circulation, that's international trade and investment, is meant to reinforce and support the domestic economy, rather than being the primary engine of growth as it arguably was before. Key objectives include significantly enhancing domestic demand, achieving much greater self-reliance in critical sectors, particularly advanced technology.
Tech self-sufficiency.
Exactly. And making China's domestic market less vulnerable to external shocks, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical pressures like tariffs. At the same time, paradoxically perhaps, they aim to make China's economy more indispensable globally by being a huge, stable domestic market.
What motivated this shift? Was it just the trade war?
The dual circulation strategy was definitely developed and accelerated in direct response to a convergence of external challenges. The U.S.-China trade war was a huge part of it, yes, but also increasing U.S. restrictions on Chinese technology companies like Huawei, the global economic disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and a broader perception in Beijing of rising anti-globalization sentiment and protectionism in Western countries. It was a response to a perceived hostile external environment.
So for China's leadership, this became about more than just economics.
Absolutely. Achieving greater economic and technological self-sufficiency under this strategy became increasingly viewed as a matter of national security, not just economic policy. This policy represents a fundamental long-term shift in China's approach, aimed at significantly reducing its vulnerability to external pressures, particularly those coming from the U.S.
And the implications of that are potentially massive for the global economy.
Profound implications for global supply chains, for China's future role in the world economy. It potentially leads to the development of more distinct economic and technological spheres or blocks globally, a less integrated world, perhaps.
It seems clear that the U.S. Section 301 tariffs, and especially the associated technology restrictions, were seen in Beijing as directly targeting the foundations of China's industrial policy and its aspirations for technological leadership, particularly initiatives like Made in China 2025.
That's how it was perceived, yes. As a potentially existential challenge to China's long-term development model. And it directly prompted China to adopt the dual circulation strategy, emphasizing indigenous innovation and strengthening domestic strength as a long-term strategic countermeasure. A defensive move, but a profound one.
Compare that to the EU's situation. While the EU faced economically significant U.S. tariffs and responded strategically, Those actions didn't really constitute a similarly broad assault on the fundamental tenets of the EU's economic model, did they?
No, it was different in nature. The EU faced tariffs on specific sectors like steel, aluminum, potentially autos, and in the aircraft dispute. Significant, yes, but not the kind of comprehensive pressure targeting the core industrial strategy and tech sector that China perceived from the Section 301 actions and tech restrictions.
And this difference in the nature and perceived intent of the U.S. actions led to those distinct strategic responses we discussed.
Exactly. The EU focused on diversifying partnerships, reinforcing the multilateral system where possible, developing tools like the ACI to defend interests within that system. China, facing what it saw as a broader containment effort, pursued a more fundamental reorientation of its entire economic paradigm towards self-reliance. Different threats, different responses.
Okay, let's try to sum up China's powerful, multifaceted response. China implemented mirroring tariffs on strategically important U.S. exports like agriculture and autos to exert pressure and political pain back on the U.S.
Right. They heavily leveraged the WTO dispute settlement system, aiming for legal condemnation of U.S. actions and positioning itself as a defender of the multilateral system, though U.S. appeals into the appellate body void prevented final rulings.
Got it. Complex negotiations led to the Phase 1 trade deal, which included ambitious U.S. purchase commitments that China ultimately fell significantly short on fulfilling.
Yes, the unmet promises. And most profoundly, confronted by broad U.S. tariffs and tech restrictions seen as an assault on its growth model, China formally adopted the dual circulation strategy, signaling a fundamental long-term reorientation towards domestic strength and technological self-reliance as a defense against external pressure. That's the big takeaway.
Okay, here are some key facts about China's response for you. China retaliated on 3-day U.S. goods, fruits, nuts, pork, for U.S. steel aluminum tariffs in 2018.
The initial response.
China mirrored U.S. Section 301 tariffs, applying 25% on $50 fee soybeans, autos, chemicals, and up to 25% on another $60 reveal. List 3.
Matching the escalation.
China challenged U.S. 301 tariffs at WTO, DS 543, and the panel later ruled U.S. tariffs inconsistent, but the U.S. appealed into the void.
To WTO fight.
The Phase 1 deal, Jan 2020, had China commit to $200 extra U.S. purchases over 2020-21, but they fell significantly short, 58-62%.
The purchase shortfall.
China formally adopted the dual circulation strategy, prioritizing domestic economy and tech self-reliance, partly in response to the trade war. Dual circulation.
The big strategic shift.
A WTO panel later found China's retaliation against U.S. 232 tariffs inconsistent, DS 558, citing the complex legal implications of the U.S. using the national security exception.
That legal twist again.
Now, a critical development running throughout this entire period, and one that severely impacted the ability to resolve these disputes through established mechanisms, was the incapacitation of the WTO appellate body. You mentioned it several times. It's essentially the organization's highest court for resolving trade disputes.
Yes, the Supreme Court of World Trade, effectively. And it became incapacitated because the U.S. administration systematically blocked the appointment and reappointment of new members to the appellate body.
Why did they do that? What was the U.S. reasoning?
The U.S. cited long-standing concerns, across multiple administrations actually, about what it viewed as judicial overreach by the body. They argued it was departing from the agreed rules, exceeding its mandate, essentially making new trade law instead of just interpreting the existing agreements.
And the consequence was stark.
Absolutely. By December 10th, 2019, the appellate body simply did not have enough members. It lost the quorum necessary to hear new appeals. It effectively became non-functional, shut down.
And this paralysis had severe real-world consequences for the trade disputes we've been discussing.
Huge consequences. It meant that any WTO member who lost a panel ruling like the U.S. did in several of these tariff cases could simply appeal that report into the void. Since there was no functioning appellate body to hear the appeal, the process was just blocked indefinitely. It prevented the adoption of final binding rulings.
So it basically crippled the WTO's primary enforcement mechanism for trade rules.
That's exactly what happened.
And this directly impacted the resolution of the numerous disputes filed by the EU and China against the U.S. tariffs. When WTO panels issued rulings adverse to the U.S., finding U.S. actions inconsistent with trade rules, which they often did, the U.S. could and did appeal these reports without any possibility of a final appellate review.
Correct. From the perspective of the U.S. administration at the time, these actions against the appellate body, while framed as an attempt to force reform on an institution it saw as flawed, effectively provided a shield against definitive WTO condemnation of its own tariff measures.
It seems paradoxical.
It created a somewhat paradoxical situation, yes. The U.S. was initiating unilateral trade actions while simultaneously undermining the primary multilateral mechanism designed to review and adjudicate those very actions.
Let's quickly revisit the strategic implications of the EU and Chinese arguments at the WTO. Both actively used the WTO dispute settlement system to challenge the legality of the U.S. tariffs. Their objective wasn't just to seek a technical legal remedy, right? It was also about optics.
Absolutely. It was also about attaining international legal validation for their positions and framing the U.S. actions as clear violations of international trade law, winning the narrative war.
Their core arguments centered on the U.S. measures violating fundamental WTO principles that we touched on, like the most favored nation principle, GATT Article 1, preventing discrimination among trading partners by unfairly targeting specific countries.
And the rules on tariff bindings, GATT Article 2, which prohibit imposing duties above agreed-upon levels. They also challenge the procedural and substantive basis of the U.S. actions, particularly the invocation of national security under JAT Article Text 1 for the Section 232 tariffs, arguing that this exception was being improperly used simply to justify protectionist measures.
These disputes, particularly the challenges to the U.S. use of the national security exception, really brought fundamental questions to the forefront of international trade law, didn't they?
They really did. Questions about the scope of the national security exception, whether it could even be reviewed by a WTO panel. Historically, it was seen as largely self-judging, and the broader balance between a member's perceived right to take unilateral action for national security reasons and its binding commitments under the multilateral trade framework. Big systemic questions.
The period from 2017 to 2021 truly constituted a significant stress test for the WTO as an institution.
A massive stress test. It exposed the institution's vulnerabilities when a major member decides to pursue unilateralism while simultaneously undermining the dispute settlement functions designed to manage conflicts among members.
It just spurred change.
Well, this whole experience has certainly spurred ongoing discussions about potential WTO reform trying to fix the system. But it has also arguably encouraged other nations to explore more unilateral or plurilateral approaches to trade governance themselves, perhaps leading to further fragmentation of the global trading system over time if the WTO can't regain its footing.
Okay, quick recap on the WTO system under stress. The U.S. systematically blocked appointments to the WTO appellate body, effectively crippling its ability to issue final binding rulings by December 2019.
Crucial point. This meant the U.S. could appeal adverse panel rulings against its tariff actions into the void, shielding those actions from definitive condemnation under international trade law.
Right. Meanwhile, both the EU and China strategically used the WTO to challenge the legality of U.S. measures, putting fundamental questions about trade rules, especially the use of the national security exception, squarely in the spotlight, using the system to highlight its weaknesses.
Exactly. Now, looking back at the strategic responses, let's try to compare and contrast how the EU and China handled the U.S. tariff offensive, because we see both significant similarities and some really important differences.
Okay, similarities first. There were definitely common threads in their broad approaches, right? Both mounted substantial responses that combined immediate countermeasures with longer-term strategic adjustments to their trade policies.
Definitely. Both employed retaliatory tariffs as a primary instrument to push back against the U.S. actions. And a common feature was the strategic selection of U.S. exports for those tariffs. As we discussed, they often targeted agricultural products and iconic manufactured goods from politically sensitive regions in the U.S.
The political targeting again?
Right. This wasn't just about matching the economic value of the U.S. tariffs. It was clearly aimed at maximizing domestic U.S. political pressure, going beyond purely economic rebalancing.
And the trade dispute spurred both the EU and China to pursue broader strategic adjustments in their trade and economic policies.
Yes, both sought to diversify their trade relationships, reducing reliance on potentially unpredictable partners like the U.S. had become, and to enhance their overall economic resilience against external pressures and shocks, building defenses.
Okay, but the differences are also significant, reflecting the distinct challenges each faced. A major difference was the sheer scale and scope of the U.S. tariffs they were up against.
Huge difference there. China was the target of a much larger and more comprehensive U.S. tariff campaign, particularly through those multiple tranches on Section 301 tariffs, which were explicitly China-specific and covered hundreds of billions of dollars in trade value, a much broader assault.
In contrast, the EU's retaliatory actions were more specifically focused on the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs and the tariffs linked to the aircraft subsidy dispute. While significant, the scope and economic value were considerably smaller than the U.S. tariffs China faced.
That's a key quantitative difference. And the nature of their resulting policy shifts also differed quite significantly. China's responses, particularly the formal adoption of the dual circulation strategy and the intensified push for technological self-sufficiency under initiatives like Made in China 2025, signaled a more fundamental, state-directed reorientation of its entire economic model.
Why such a fundamental shift for China?
It was largely driven by that perception in Beijing that the U.S. actions, especially in the technology sphere, represented a long-term, perhaps existential effort to contain China's economic and technological ascent. The response was a decision to double down on building domestic strength and reducing vulnerability, a strategic imperative.
Whereas the EU's policy shifts, while significant, like strategic autonomy and the ACI groundwork, were maybe more focused
on diversifying trade partners, reinforcing the multilateral system where possible, and developing tools to better defend its existing economic interests within that system, rather than a complete reorientation away from it.
So the differing nature and perceived intent of the U.S. actions elicited these distinct strategic reactions from the EU and China, reflecting different threat levels.
I think that's right. It reflects varying levels of perceived threat and different geopolitical realities and vulnerabilities.
Assessing the overall effectiveness of these responses and the U.S. tariff strategy from 2017-2021. It's complex, but sources characterize it as a pretty mixed picture, right?
Yeah, very mixed. China's Phase 1 deal did lead to some U.S. tariff rollbacks, specifically on List 4A goods. But as we saw, China's ambitious purchase commitments were largely unmet. It was primarily a managed trade deal and didn't fundamentally address the underlying structural issues the U.S. initially raised. Limited success, you could say.
And the EU's outcome.
The EU's persistence eventually led to the replacement of Section 232 tariffs with TRQs in October 2021, which was framed as a partial victory for the EU. It restored more predictable, if limited, access to the U.S. market compared to the flat tariffs.
What about the WTO panel rulings?
Symbolically important in condemning U.S. measures, yes, but they lacked immediate enforcement power due to the appellate body crisis.
Yeah.
So, a legal win on paper, but not much practical effect immediately.
Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the U.S. actions was how they inadvertently pushed both the EU and China to accelerate their own respective strategic adjustments.
That's a really important point. The EU's drive for strategic autonomy and new FTAs with partners like Japan and China's dual circulation strategy and intensified focus on Made in China 2025, these suggest moves towards greater self-reliance and diversified partnerships on both sides.
So these deeper shifts, catalyzed by the trade disputes of 2017-2021, they might ultimately prove more impactful in reshaping global economic spheres of influence and supply chains than the immediate outcomes of tariff negotiations or those unresolved WTO rulings.
It's quite possible the long-term strategic adjustments might be the biggest legacy of this whole period.
Okay, let's do a mega recap on the WTO stress test and the comparative responses.
Okay.
The U.S. undermining of the WTO's appellate body significantly weakened the global trading system's ability to resolve disputes, including challenges to the U.S.'s own tariff actions, by allowing appeals to block final rulings.
Got it. The crippled court. Comparing the EU and China's strategies, while both used retaliation and WTO challenges, China faced a much larger scale of U.S. tariffs, particularly the extensive Section 301 measures, leading to a more fundamental economic reorientation towards technological self-reliance and the dual circulation strategy.
Right, different scale, different response.
Yeah.
The EU's focus was more on achieving strategic autonomy and diversifying trade partners within the existing international system, adapting rather than rebuilding.
Exactly. Experts assess that the most significant long-term impact of the U.S. tariffs might be less about achieving specific trade outcomes and more about accelerating these deeper strategic shifts in both the EU and China towards greater self-reliance and diversified partnerships. The unintended consequences, perhaps.
Here are some key takeaways from that period, flashcard style. U.S. blocking appointments crippled the WTO appellate body by December 2019, preventing final rulings on disputes.
The paralysis point.
Both EU and China appealed adverse WTO panel findings against the U.S. into the void.
Using the broken system.
It's a key difference. China faced broader, China-specific Section 301 tariffs covering hundreds of billions of dollars of trade.
Scale matters.
China's response involved a more fundamental economic shift. The dual circulation strategy focused on domestic strength and tech self-reliance. Dual circulation.
The inward turn.
The EU's response emphasized strategic autonomy and diversifying trade partners, like Japan, to reduce dependence on the U.S.
Building resilience.
Experts assess the long-term impact of U.S. tariffs might be accelerating these deeper strategic shifts in EU-China towards greater self-reliance.
The ripple effect.
Now let's transition from that first era of blunt force diplomacy using tariffs and see how these tactics have made a rapid return in 2025. Because of Donald Trump's return to the White House in January 2025, tariff threats have again become a centerpiece of U.S. trade policy, perhaps even more aggressively than before.
It seems so. The second Trump administration has quickly deployed tariffs not only in traditional trade disputes, but notably to pursue objectives in unrelated areas, such as immigration control and combating the flow of illegal drugs like fentanyl.
Using tariffs for non-trade goals.
Exactly. Early developments suggest an even more confrontational stance than we saw between 2017 and 2021.
Let's look at North America first in early 2025. On Inauguration Day itself, President Trump immediately warned the U.S.'s closest neighbors, Canada and Mexico, of sweeping tariffs. He stated publicly that he would impose a 25% tariff on essentially all imports from both countries unless they did significantly more to stop the flow of migrants and fentanyl drugs across the borders.
Wow. An extraordinary and immediate linkage of tariffs to non-trade issues right out of the gate.
Faced with this sudden ultimatum, Canada and Mexico scrambled to respond.
Understandably. The Canadian Prime Minister quickly sought a meeting with President Trump, and Mexico's government launched high-profile drug busts and deployments to demonstrate cooperation. These gestures were clearly intended to buy some time and signal willingness to engage, but sources suggest they did not fully appease Trump.
So the threat wasn't withdrawn.
No. Within days of taking office, President Trump invoked emergency economic powers to formally implement his threat, imposing 25% tariffs on most goods from both Canada and Mexico.
And how did they respond to the actual tariffs?
Both Canada and Mexico swiftly announced their own retaliatory tariffs in return, bringing the heavily integrated North American economy right to the brink of a full-blown trade war. Immediate escalation.
Was there any resolution?
A temporary truce was reportedly reached by early spring 2025, possibly involving behind-the-scenes promises by Canada and Mexico to take further action on U.S. concerns regarding migration and fentanyl. However, the situation remains volatile and the tariffs' future is very uncertain.
What's critical to note here is that observers point out these tariffs directly violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the USMCA agreement, the deal that replaced NAFTA and was supposed to ensure tariff-free trade across North America.
The deal Trump himself negotiated.
Exactly. Trump's actions have immediately called into question the very survival of USMCA. If the tariffs aren't lifted, the agreement's core benefits for businesses are nullified, and Trump has even publicly mused about withdrawing from USMCA entirely, putting everything back on the table.
So in the very short term, did the blunt force threat work? Did it coerce concessions?
It seems the 25% tariff threat did coerce some immediate concessions, or at least gestures of cooperation. Mexico ramped up enforcement against fentanyl trafficking and border movements, and Canada showed immediate diplomatic urgency.
But are these substantive changes?
Many analysts view these initial responses as potentially more cosmetic than substantive, done primarily to alleviate the immediate tariff pressure. Meanwhile, the tariffs themselves, once enacted, impose significant economic costs on all sides.
Given the deep integration of Canada's and Mexico's economies with the U.S., a full-blown tariff war would be incredibly damaging for everyone involved, characterized by many as disastrous for supply chains, especially in the highly integrated auto industry.
Are there estimates of the economic cost?
Yes, economic model estimates from groups like the Peterson Institute for International Economics projected that the proposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, if sustained, could knock $200 billion off U.S. GDP over Trump's term and cost Canada around $100 billion, while causing Mexico's GDP to fall by 2% relative to baseline. Huge numbers.
These are very significant self-inflicted costs for the U.S., considering Canada and Mexico are its top two trading partners.
Absolutely. Furthermore, such measures could potentially backfire on Trump's stated non-trade goals. For instance, a severe economic hit to Mexico could actually increase pressure for migration to the U.S., undermining the very rationale of using tariffs on immigration.
So it's too early to declare victory on this tactic.
Way too early. The longer-term risk is that the trust and goodwill built up under USMCA erodes completely, potentially jeopardizing cooperation on security and immigration issues later. In sum, the 2025 tariff threats towards Canada and Mexico have so far yielded only fragile, surface-level gestures of cooperation while severely endangering a critical economic and security alliance. High stakes.
Turning now to China. Trump has also returned to this relationship with renewed vigor and a clear intent to escalate in 2025. Citing continued frustration that China still hasn't stopped the flow of fentanyl precursors into the U.S. and alleging continued unfair trade practices.
Familiar themes.
Trump in early 2025 announced an additional 10% tariff on essentially all Chinese imports, on top of the existing tariffs that remained from the first trade war. Sure, another layer of tariffs.
And this move came despite him having floated much higher rates during the 2024 campaign, right? Where he had at times threatened a 60% tariff or even that 100% tariff on the BRICS countries, which includes China. So 10% was less than the most extreme rhetoric. It's still a significant escalation.
How did China respond initially?
In response, China's initial counter-response was relatively measured, at least publicly. Beijing allowed its currency, the yuan, to devalue somewhat to offset some of the tariff impact on its exports, a tactic it also used back in 2019. However, Chinese officials made clear they would retaliate in kind if higher U.S. tariffs persisted. The threat of retaliation is there.
What are the projected economic effects if this escalates into a tit-for-tat tariff war?
Analysts at PIE projected that if China fully retaliated tit-for-tat with its own 10% tariffs on U.S. goods, the result would be significant economic costs for both sides. They projected a $55 billion loss in U.S. GDP over 4 years, and an even larger $128 billion loss for China's GDP.
And inflation.
Both countries would likely see inflation tick up due to costlier imports, U.S. consumer prices by about 0.2%, and China's by 0.3%. These are not insignificant drags on economic growth and living standards for both sides, clearly illustrating that a tariff escalation hurts both economies involved. No winners there.
Strategically, what's the aim of Trump's renewed tariffs on China? Is it about forcing a new deal?
It appears aimed at forcing Beijing back to the negotiating table for a broader Phase 2 type of deal, something that never materialized in the first term. There have been hints that China might engage, perhaps offering just enough concessions to delay or reduce tariffs.
What kind of concessions might China offer?
Experts speculate that China's leader, Xi Jinping, who is arguably in a stronger political position now than during the first trade war, could choose to offer limited concessions, maybe stepping up actions on fentanyl, granting market access in certain narrow sectors, or resuming purchases of specific U.S. goods, primarily to alleviate the immediate U.S. tariff pressure and buy time, rather than making fundamental changes.
But given China's track record with Phase 1 and its focus on dual circulation, is Beijing likely to make major concessions under pressure this time?
That's the big question. Given that China did not fully comply with the Phase 1 purchase commitments and has since invested heavily in diversifying its import sources and promoting technological self-reliance through dual circulation, Beijing's core calculus in 2025 may be to resist outright capitulation. Xi may prefer to simply wait out the Trump administration or counterpunch with non-tariff measures.
Like what?
Things like export restrictions on critical minerals where China dominates supply, or increased scrutiny and harassment of U.S. firms operating in China, rather than making fundamental economic concessions under duress. They have other tools besides tariffs.
So the effectiveness of Trump's new China tariffs as a negotiating tool remains uncertain.
Highly uncertain. Thus far, they have not yielded a concrete new, broad agreement. Instead, they risk reigniting a full-scale trade war at a time when U.S.-China relations are already incredibly tense across multiple fronts.
Could we see smaller deals?
It's possible we might see small interim deals, maybe on specific agricultural purchases or access for particular goods. But major structural concessions from China appear elusive with this approach. Many economists argue that Trump's tariff-centric approach is ill-suited to achieve deep reforms in China's state-driven economic model, suggesting that multilateral pressure and coordination with allies might be more effective. But the 2025 approach, like in 2018, appears largely unilateral, foregoing that potential leverage.
Okay, let's recap the rapid return of tariffs in 2025. With the start of the second Trump administration, tariffs quickly returned, notably expanding to link threats against North America, Canada, and Mexico to non-trade issues like immigration and fentanyl.
Right, the linkage.
Yeah.
This led to the formal imposition of 25% tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and immediate retaliatory threats, bringing the continent to the brink of a trade war and jeopardizing USMCA.
Yep. The administration also escalated tariffs with China, imposing an additional 10% tariff on most imports, risking a full-scale trade war with projected high economic costs for both sides.
China escalation. While these aggressive actions create immediate pressure and have resulted in some initial gestures as of mid-2025, they haven't yet translated into significant new trade agreements, and partners are showing signs of pushing back or digging in rather than making major structural concessions. Limited results so far.
The Trump 2025 trade agenda has also quickly impacted other allies beyond North America, hasn't it? With the auto tariffs.
Yes. By March 2025, the administration moved to impose the long-threatened 25% tariff on foreign autos and auto parts, again justified on national security grounds using Section 232. This is a sweeping tariff that significantly impacts the European auto industry, with Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Mexico among the largest auto suppliers to the U.S. market. A huge move.
What's been the immediate fallout from that?
Sharp criticism from those affected governments and rapid discussions of retaliation. The EU, for example, quickly announced it was preparing retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products and is also exploring formal cases at the World Trade Organization, just like they did in the first term. Deja vu.
And Japan and South Korea. They thought they were safe.
They had thought earlier negotiations had perhaps averted this scenario, so now they're grappling with a major new barrier to their significant auto exports. A big shock for them.
Is there a domestic political angle to these auto tariffs?
Oh, definitely. It's worth noting that domestically, U.S. labor unions like the United Auto Workers praised the auto tariffs, calling them a long overdue step to protect American manufacturing jobs. This highlights how, from a political perspective, Trump sees potential benefit in using tariffs to appeal to industrial workers, even if it comes at the cost of straining alliances with key security partners, playing to the base.
Additionally, Trump in 2025 doubled down on metal tariffs globally.
Yes, he briefly raised the steel tariff to a striking 50% before settling it back at the 25% level seen in the first term. Allies like the EU and Japan that had negotiated special tariff rate quota arrangements with the Biden administration to replace the original 232 tariffs are now in a difficult spot, as those prior arrangements appear to be in jeopardy.
Are allies getting any exemptions?
Some have sought exemptions or special deals to avoid these renewed tariffs, with the UK reportedly securing a limited arrangement, but the overall trend is towards broader application.
Have these broad tariffs on allies yielded any specific new trade agreements yet?
So far, no. They haven't yielded specific new trade agreements. They appear primarily punitive or intended as leverage for future, undefined negotiations with these partners on a range of issues, perhaps including critical minerals or other supply chain topics. Setting the stage, maybe.
How are allies generally responding this time around? Are they just caving?
Early evidence suggests allies are generally more inclined to push back or seek accommodations that don't involve major structural concessions rather than simply capitulating under pressure. The EU, for one, has emphasized unity among member states and retaliation through WTO consistent measures where possible. South Korea's government criticized the U.S. auto tariff move, but is constrained in its potential response given its heavy security reliance on the U.S., although it faces domestic election pressure to defend its key industries. So, varied responses, but not outright surrender.
What does this mean for overall U.S. tariff levels now, in mid-2025?
It means significantly heightened tariff levels compared to the period before 2017 or during the Biden administration. By one estimate from the Peterson Institute, as of May 2025, the average effective U.S. tariff rate on imports stands around 17.8%.
17.8%. That sounds high.
It is. This is the highest level the U.S. has seen since 1934, whereas it was approximately 2.5% before the first Trump administration's tariff actions began. This reflects the widespread proliferation of tariffs across different partners and products under the administration's strategy. A massive increase in barriers.
And the economic effects of these renewed and expanded tariffs, what are the projections?
Analysts project the 2025 tariffs could raise the U.S. price level by about 1.7% in the short run, effectively costing the average American household about $2,300 per year in higher prices for goods. That's a direct hit to consumers' wallets.
These are broad-based costs on consumers and businesses that, if they persist, could dampen consumer spending and overall economic growth.
That's the concern, yes.
So in terms of effectiveness for extracting major concessions, it's still too early to see significant successes in 2025.
Simply too early. What we observe is an initial phase of intense brinkmanship. President Trump has very publicly put his chips on the table with tariffs threatening virtually everyone, and other countries are assessing their options whether to try to negotiate limited deals, simply retaliate and ride out the storm, or seek exemptions.
We saw Canada and Mexico get a temporary truce.
Yes, they showed willingness to placate U.S. demands to some extent to get that temporary truce, and there are rumors of quiet talks reopening with other partners. But as of mid-2025, no new trade agreements of any substance have been signed with key allies, and the global trade climate remains one of high tension and uncertainty.
Does the Trump team still believe this strategy works?
They continue to frame the tariffs as a necessary means to achieve fair deals eventually. They point to internal assessments claiming tariffs in the first term were effective and had minimal negative impact claims contested by many independent economists, signaling a continued belief in the efficacy of the strategy, despite the evidence of significant costs and limited gains pointed out by others.
Okay, let's do our end of chapter mega recap on tariffs in 2025. Tariffs returned rapidly with the second Trump administration, notably expanding to target Canada and Mexico with threats linked to non-trade issues like immigration and fentanyl, leading to tariff imposition and retaliatory threats that immediately jeopardized USMCA.
Check. Non-trade linkage. The administration also imposed the long-threatened 25% tariff on foreign autos and parts, hitting key allies like the EU, Japan, and South Korea hard and triggering immediate discussions of retaliation.
The auto tariffs. By mid-2025, the widespread application of tariffs had raised the average effective U.S. tariff rate to an estimated 17.8%, the highest level since 1934, reflecting a significant escalation of trade barriers.
Record high rates.
Yeah.
While these aggressive tariff actions create immediate pressure and have prompted some initial responses from partners, they have not yet translated into significant new trade agreements or major concessions, leaving the global trade climate highly tense and projecting substantial economic costs for both the U.S. and its trading partners if they persist. Pressure, yes. Deals, no.
Here are some key facts from the 2025 situation. In Jan 2025, Trump threatened 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico unless they acted on immigration fentanyl, explicitly linking tariffs to non-trade issues.
The linkage threat.
These 2025 tariffs were formally imposed despite violating the spirit of USMCA, leading to retaliatory threats.
USMCA undermined.
Also in 2025, Trump announced an additional 10% tariff on essentially all Chinese imports, adding to existing tariffs.
China escalation again.
In March 2025, the long-threatened 25% tariff on foreign auto parts was imposed, significantly impacting EU, Japan, and South Korea.
The auto bomb.
As of mid-2025, the average effective U.S. tariff rate is estimated at 17.8%, the highest since 1934.
High watermark.
While projected costs of the 2025 tariffs include a 1.7% rise in U.S. consumer prices, potentially costing the average household $2,300 a year.
Consumer pain.
So, bringing all of this together, looking across both Trump administrations, what's the final verdict on the overall effectiveness of using tariff threats as a primary tool for extracting trade concessions? How do the sources assess it?
Well, sources characterize it as a decidedly mixed picture. You see some immediate tactical wins, sure, but they seem to have come at significant long-term costs and often had pretty limited scope in terms of actual change.
Let's recap some of those areas where brinkmanship arguably compelled partners to come to the table and make some concessions, even if limited. The USMCA renegotiation.
Right. With the renegotiation of NAFTA into USMCA, Canada and Mexico ultimately agreed to update the agreement with provisions more favorable to U.S. interests, things like higher regional auto content rules, labor reforms in Mexico, greater U.S. access to Canada's dairy market. This was largely achieved under the pressure of potential withdrawal from NAFTA and threats of broad auto tariffs. Pressure worked to an extent.
And the U.S.-China Phase 1 deal.
While limited in scope, China did make those unprecedented purchase commitments and, for the first time in a trade agreement, made written acknowledgments of issues like forced technology transfer and improving IP protection areas prior Chinese governments had resisted formally addressing. This was arguably a direct result of facing escalating tariffs that were inflicting real pain on their economy.
What about deals with other allies like South Korea or Japan?
With the bilateral deals reached with South Korea, Corus, and Japan, South Korea conceded on some auto and steel issues in response to U.S. pressure, and Japan opened its agriculture market more than it initially desired, specifically to avoid tariffs. These examples show instances where hardball tactics delivered specific negotiating wins, often relatively quickly, by leveraging the threat of significant economic disruption through tariffs.
We also saw how tariff threats were used to achieve ad hoc policy changes outside of formal trade deals, right? Like with Mexico on immigration.
Exactly. The June 2019 tariff threat against Mexico over illegal immigration, for example, was withdrawn after Mexico agreed to deploy its National Guard and expand a program to keep asylum seekers in Mexico while their U.S. claims were processed. Similarly, early indications in 2025 suggest Mexico's drug interdiction efforts were bolstered under renewed tariff pressure. This demonstrates the use of tariffs as leverage even for non-trade domestic policy goals of another country. A versatile, if blunt, tool.
Okay, so there were some wins, some concessions extracted.
Right.
But when you scrutinize the actual concessions obtained and the agreements reached, were they really game changers?
Well, many were quite modest, partial, or maybe even cosmetic compared to the initial demands or the stated goals of fundamentally rebalancing trade relationships. Take USMCA versus the original NAFTA. Most independent analysis suggests the improvements, while real, were relatively small in economic magnitude for the U.S., resulting in only minor net benefits for overall U.S. growth.
Not a huge economic win.
Not huge overall. Some changes might help specific U.S. industries, but could also raise production costs for others. Importantly, Canada and Mexico largely preserved core duty-free trade in most sectors, making concessions more around the edges than a fundamental capitulation. Critics even dryly nicknamed it NAFTA Point 7 because some aspects were actually seen as more restrictive.
The U.S.-China Phase 1 deal. We already touched on this, but the assessment.
Widely considered a failure by many experts, especially regarding its signature component, those purchase commitments. The ambitious promise of a $200 billion boost in U.S. purchases simply did not materialize, which not only denied the U.S. expected export gains, but also arguably eroded U.S. credibility in future negotiations.
And the structural issues.
The structural concessions obtained from China were often seen as either under-implemented or too narrow to address the big picture issues driving the U.S. concerns. The trade war overall did not mark a significant shift away from China's state-driven economic model. Academic consensus often suggests the U.S. either lost or at best fought to a draw in that phase of the conflict.
What about the renegotiated deals with allies like Chorus or the Japan mini deal?
Also characterized by their limited scope. Chorus changes were often described as minor tweaks by analysts. The Japan trade deal opened some agricultural markets but left the biggest trade issues like autos, services, currency largely untouched for another day. Some experts pointed out that these deals often amounted to the U.S. simply clawing back for its industries some of the benefits it had lost by unilaterally withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. So maybe regaining lost ground rather than breaking new ground?
A striking feature of this era was the notable absence of any comprehensive new free trade agreements that substantially liberalized trade and opened major new markets for U.S. exporters globally.
That's a very important point. Instead, the pattern was more about defensive or managed trade agreements. The focus on reducing bilateral deficits and protecting specific domestic industries meant the concessions extracted were often about limiting imports through quotas, tighter rules of origin, or setting specific purchase targets.
Managing trade, not freeing it.
Exactly. Rather than broadly expanding U.S. export opportunities through market liberalization, this approach is generally viewed by economists as creating inefficient distortions in global trade flows. It's not the traditional free trade agenda.
Now let's talk about the costs, because these successes, however limited, weren't free. What were the major costs associated with this tariff strategy?
The costs were significant and multifaceted. A major cost was the economic strain, which sources indicate was largely borne by U.S. importers and, crucially, by U.S. consumers through higher prices.
We saw the projections for 2025.
Right. Evidence includes numerous initial studies from the first term and those 2025 projections, like the estimate that the current tariffs could raise consumer prices by about 1.7% and cost the average household around $2,300 per year. Long-run estimates from 2020 also suggested potential small but measurable losses in U.S. GDP and jobs, a direct tax on Americans, essentially.
And what about U.S. exporters? They got hit by retaliation, right?
Oh, absolutely. U.S. exporters were directly punished by the foreign retaliatory tariffs that partners like China and the EU imposed in response to the U.S. actions. U.S. farmers, in particular, saw exports to key markets like China and Europe plummet, leading to significant financial distress.
Didn't the government step in with aid?
Yes. The U.S. government ended up spending substantial taxpayer money, estimated at approximately $28 billion in farm aid alone during the first term, to compensate those hurt by foreign retaliation and to manage domestic oversupply caused by lost export markets. In effect, some of the perceived tariff leverage came at the cost of U.S. taxpayer-funded bailouts for injured industries, shifting the cost.
What about business investment? Did the uncertainty have an impact?
Definitely. The unpredictable and often abrupt nature of the tariff threats created significant uncertainty for businesses. And businesses hate uncertainty. This unpredictability chilled investment. Companies delayed decisions on building new plants or expanding operations, and many incurred costs to restructure their supply chains,
Moving production.
often shifting suppliers to countries in Southeast Asia or elsewhere, rather than necessarily reshoring production back to the U.S. in large numbers. The period of escalating trade tensions also corresponded with slower U.S. manufacturing output growth by 2019, and surveys of business sentiment consistently highlighted trade policy uncertainty as a major risk factor for the economy.
Beyond the direct economic costs, there were also significant geopolitical and strategic costs. Damage to relationships.
Huge costs there. Using tariffs, especially on close allies, introduced major friction and sowed discord among democratic partners. Allies like Canada and European nations were genuinely shocked and offended to find themselves labeled as national security threats to the U.S. just to justify tariffs on steel or cars.
Eroding trust.
Analysts argued this approach was damaging global trust in the U.S. as a reliable partner by weaponizing the very economic interdependence that underpins alliances. It was seen as using economic muscle against your own team, so to speak.
Did this have lasting effects?
While allies did eventually negotiate under duress and reach some limited agreements, the resentment and distrust created could have lasting implications. For example, Europe's accelerated drive for strategic autonomy, partly to avoid being as vulnerable to U.S. economic pressure again, reflects a long-term cost to U.S. influence. South Korea likely felt humiliated at being forced into changes to the Chorus deal so soon after it was finalized. These intangible costs to U.S. soft power and alliance cohesion might ultimately outweigh the value of a few extra billion in exports gained through managed trade deals. Hard to quantify, but very real.
In China's posture, did it soften or harden over time?
It seems to have hardened. Initially surprised perhaps by the intensity of the U.S. pressure, Beijing did eventually come to the table and negotiate Phase 1. But as the conflict wore on and U.S. pressure, particularly on technology, continued, Chinese leadership seems to have adopted a more defiant long-term posture, emphasizing self-reliance, that dual circulation, and doubling down on industrial subsidies to weather decoupling.
So by 2025, they were maybe less easily pressured.
By the time of Trump's 2025 return, Xi Jinping was arguably in a stronger political position domestically, and, sources suggest, potentially less likely to be pressured into major concessions, having accelerated contingency plans. Any short-term concessions from China now might be more tactical maneuvers than indicative of a real change in fundamental economic direction. They learned how to manage the pressure.
What about trade deficits? That was a key metric for the first Trump administration. Did the tariffs fix the trade deficit?
Not clearly, no. The U.S. global trade deficit in goods actually expanded during Trump's first term, hitting record highs by 2020. While the bilateral deficit with China initially shrank somewhat, trade simply shifted to other countries, Vietnam, Mexico, etc., and by 2022, the overall U.S.-China trade deficit was climbing again.
So tariffs just moved the deficit around.
That reinforces the economic consensus. Tariffs primarily reallocate trade flows, but often fail to reduce overall imbalances if underlying macroeconomic factors, like national savings and investment rates, remain unchanged. The deficits persisted, and manufacturing job growth was more cyclical than clearly tariff-driven.
So perspectives on the overall effectiveness of the tariff strategy really vary depending on who you ask.
Absolutely. From the view of President Trump and his supporters, even the relatively small concessions obtained validated the tough unilateral approach. They might argue that previous presidents got nothing from China or from tweaking NAFTA, whereas Trump at least got new terms, even if imperfect. They also point to limited revitalization in certain specific industries like steel and aluminum, and claim tariffs created leverage for non-trade goals, citing the outcome with Mexico on immigration in 2019 and early signs in 2025. They see it as proof that the toughness worked.
But many economists and trade experts have a different view.
Yes, many view the overall strategy as economically inefficient and politically blunt, with a poor cost-benefit calculus. They argue the concessions won were modest at best, and often came at disproportionately high costs to U.S. businesses and consumers, disrupted global trade, significant investment uncertainty, and severely damaged relationships with key allies. Analyses from respected groups consistently highlight these negative repercussions. The costs outweigh the benefits, in their view.
There's also the issue of credibility and long-term influence, right? Does using the threat constantly weaken it?
That's a key point. If tariff threats are used frequently and unpredictably, partners may eventually start to discount the threat or simply conclude that making concessions doesn't guarantee stability, as the U.S. might impose tariffs again anyway, even after a deal. This unpredictability can reduce the willingness of other countries to make significant concessions and instead encourage them to invest in building resilience, waiting out a particular administration, or actively seeking alternative trading partners and supply chains, exactly as we saw with the EU and China accelerating their strategic shifts. The tool becomes less effective over time.
So, in conclusion, tariff threats under Trump, they did yield some short-term tactical bargaining successes.
Yes, you could say that. In some cases, like with USMCA or the mini deal with Japan, the US arguably got slightly better terms in certain areas than might have been offered otherwise, often by leveraging the threat of severe economic pain. They forced people to the table.
However, those better terms were generally modest improvements rather than transformative wins, and they frequently came at considerable cost economic strain on the U.S. domestic economy, significant retaliatory pain for U.S. exporters, and damage to long-standing alliances and international trust.
Exactly. And in the crucial case of China, the limited concessions obtained and Beijing's subsequent failure to fully implement key aspects of Phase 1 suggests that tariffs alone were insufficient to fundamentally alter China's state-driven economic behavior or achieve deep structural changes. It wasn't the silver bullet for the China challenge.
And the second Trump administration's early flurry of tariffs in 2025 seems to be repeating this pattern, potentially on a larger scale.
It certainly looks that way. Partners are pushed to the brink with sudden threats, some token concessions or promises of talks will result, but significant collateral damage is incurred. And it remains highly doubtful whether these actions will result in enduring or fundamental trade achievements compared to their economic and strategic costs. History repeating, perhaps.
In sum, the overall effectiveness of Trump's tariff threats as a primary tool for extracting significant lasting trade concessions has been limited when viewed against the full spectrum of costs and consequences.
That seems to be the consensus assessment from many sources. They have been effective as pressure tactics to initiate negotiations and sometimes to clinch narrowly defined deals. Yet, those deals often delivered marginal benefits and left underlying systemic issues unresolved. Meanwhile, the costs, economic disruption, pain for specific industries, political friction with allies, and strategic shifts by rivals have been considerable.
As one commentator reportedly put it, Trump's trade wars arguably amounted to a major economic and strategic blunder, where the U.S. expended much effort and capital for relatively slim pickings.
That's a harsh assessment, but it reflects a common view among critics. The longer-term legacy appears to be a less stable, more fragmented global trading system, and an America that, despite some negotiated tweaks in its favor, is not obviously better off in trade terms than it was before this era of blunt force diplomacy began. Trump's tariff threats remain a high-risk gambit with a mixed track record. Impactful in the short run as a pressure tactic, but questionable in net benefit when the dust settles and the full costs are accounted for.
Will the next administration, or perhaps even a later phase of the current one, shift away from this approach in favor of greater international cooperation?
That remains to be seen. It's a huge question for the future of U.S. trade policy and global economic relations.
So, given this history, the extensive use of unilateral tariffs by the U.S. between 2017 and 2021, and the rapid return of these same tactics with new applications in 2025, what does this mean for the future of global trade? Where does this leave us?
Well, if major economic powers like the EU and China, having experienced this pressure, increasingly prioritize strategic autonomy, domestic self-reliance, and building resilience against external shocks, does this shift inevitably lead to a fragmentation of the deeply interconnected global economy we've known for decades? Are we heading towards distinct economic blocs?
It's certainly a provocative and vital question to consider as these dynamics continue to unfold on the global stage, something for all of us to watch closely.
Trade no longer lives in spreadsheets. It lives in doctrine, in legal briefs, retaliatory lists, and executive orders. Power has gone procedural. Legitimacy is now contested at the level of rules themselves. And what was once a niche legal question has become a central question of global order. In this new era of economic statecraft, law is not the conclusion. It's the opening move. Thanks for listening, and keep tuning in for more.
Please like and subscribe.